As the world recovers from one humanitarian peace bombing in Libya and braces for another possible intervention in Syria, many are now asking how it is that the so-called liberal left have become cheerleaders for the very wars of aggression they once pretended to deride. As longtime investigative reporter Pepe Escobar explains, an obscure international doctrine called Responsibility to Protect, or R2P, has been the main tool for shaping this new paradigm for the continuation of NATO's imperial power grabs around the world. This is the GRTV feature interview with your host, James Corbett, and our special guest, Pepe Escobar.
Yes, R2P became famous all over the world, of course, because of Libya last year. But this is a long story. This is a 10-year-long story. Probably many people don't remember that. So I think it's important to come back to 2001, when the original concept was actually masterminded by this fabulously named International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty. This was actually a panel. Was sponsored by the Canadian government, by the way, with some foundations backing it. And the leader was definitely not a warmonger, was a very good guy, to put it this simply. The former Australian Prime Minister, Gareth Evans. So the idea, the original idea was, I quote them, international community had a moral duty in terms of humanitarian intervention. So the original idea, of course, was altruistic. They were probably thinking about Rwanda. They were probably thinking about the Congo. They were probably even thinking about the Khmer Rouge in the 70s, right? So, but let's see how this evolved in the long run. In 2004, this original idea was already being debated at the UN. And Kofi Annan established a panel to debate it. And the Security Council was very interested in authorizing, I quote them, the Security Council, military intervention only as a last resort. So they kept the original idea of that international commission that we mentioned a while ago. And very, very important, military intervention, like we saw in Libya last year, only as a last resort. Then we get to 2005, very important, when the UN General Assembly, at the time 191 countries, they endorsed a resolution that would support R2P, but there was no vote about it, okay? Very important, always considering that no military intervention was in the cards. And finally, in 2006, the UN Security Council, only the 15, the five plus the other non-permanent members, they voted a resolution number 1674. And this resolution was basically the core of R2P, involved in protecting civilians in armed conflict and protecting civilians from, I quote them again, genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. So if we look at this timeline, it looks very altruistic and very humanitarian. But the thing is how major foreign powers were going to use this carte blanche from the UN Security Council. This didn't happen in 2007, 2008, 2009, but it happened in 2010, but it happened in 2011. This didn't happen, for instance, in late 2008, early 2009, when Israel invaded Gaza, bombed Gaza, and killed at least documented 1,400 people, including a lot of women and children. Nobody talked about R2P. But last year, with how can I describe Libya? With that mix of forced intervention, indigenous movement, military coup, you name it, fill in the blanks. They saw an opening. And when I say they, I mean especially 3 of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the US, Britain, and France. We have analyzed extensively, including you, James, in your reports, all the hidden reasons and all the different agendas for intervention in Libya. But in the case of applying R2P, there were 3 people who were instrumental in a regiment in the US support, and trying to convince other members that this was the way to go in 2011. I call them the three graces: Hillary Clinton, US Ambassador to the UN Susan Rice, and Special Advisor to President Obama Samantha Power, who was very close to Sergio Vieira de Mello when Sergio was at the UN. Sergio was the special envoy to Iraq when he was killed in Baghdad in 2003. So these three graces, they organized the media push, the one message for the Obama administration, the talks between the US, the European, especially Britain and France, and other members of the Security Council at the time, especially Arab members, and of course the Persian Gulf monarchies. So they sold the world the idea that they would intervene in Libya to prevent a humanitarian massacre that was not documented, and we later discovered was not happening. The notion that major powers like the US, or even lesser powers like Britain and France, that they conduct their foreign policy based on humanitarian principles is an absolute joke. And the proof was last year in Libya.
Unfortunately so, and I think you bring out very well the fundamental underlying hypocrisy that this is applied and invoked in situations where it's amenable to the foreign interests of Britain or France or America or Israel or any, fill in the blank, but is obviously not used in situations like in the occupation of Gaza. So I think that's a very blatant hypocrisy that's very evident to a lot of people, but clearly doesn't function at the institutional level. I mean, at what point does that disconnect become so blatant that the vast majority of the people won't go along with this responsibility to protect agenda?
Well, the thing is, the way R2P was manipulated to legitimize the invasion, bombing, and fragmentation of Libya, because this is what's happening nowadays. Look at what Libya is post-NATO intervention. It's a totally failed state run by militias. And nobody cares about what's going on in Libya. Proof number one, it disappeared from the news cycle completely. Proof number two, what only matters to the so-called international community, which, as we know, is comprised of US, Britain, France, Tel Aviv, and the Persian Gulf monarchies, and nobody else, maybe Turkey sometimes, no? Or Japan or South Korea. This is the international community. The only thing that mattered for them was the oil, gas, and further on, the water, of course. This is in terms of the three major French water companies. And nobody cares what's going to happen to Libya. Libya is going to be mired in civil war for years and probably decades from now on. But nobody cares. Okay. The thing is, a lot of very important countries at the moment, including the fourth top BRIC. Now it's BRICS with South Africa, but the fourth top BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and Germany, they saw how R2P would be instrumentalized to become basically the entry point for an armed intervention, which is condemned by the original idea of R2P itself, as we were talking a while ago, right? So that explains why they abstained from the vote in UN Security Resolution 1973. They got together before the vote. The BRICS were all in favor. South Africa didn't abstain because they got a phone call from Obama. Obama was on the phone with President Zuma for more than an hour and said, look, if you don't vote for us with this, you're going to be in trouble. And Germany as well was aligned with the BRIC in this vote. They knew what would happen later. That's exactly what we all know happened later, right? So it's a major hypocrisy because they knew that this was being instrumentalized at the time by the three Western powers at the UN Security Council. Later they say, look, if you do this with, and at the time, in fact, if you do this with Libya, why don't you do this with Bahrain? Silence, total silence, right? Why don't you do this with in fact, what's going on in eastern Saudi Arabia nowadays, which is never reported, including in Arab media, which is most of it controlled by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, it's they are killing civilians also in eastern Saudi Arabia, and we don't know about it. We hear about it by some dissident Arab bloggers here and there, but this is a slow motion process. You could compare it with what was happening in Bahrain, and you could compare it with what's happening in many other Arab countries. But the only interference is in a secular Arab republic, which is the case of Libya, and was once again invoked in the case of Syria. But now, Russia and China were very much alert to what happened before. They knew that what happened before would happen, so they voted 2 possible UN Security Council resolutions, which would regiment R2P as an intervention in Syria. So another thing, well, the case of Gaza is so blatant that we don't even need to repeat it, right? Why R2P was not invoked these past few years to prevent what we can describe very accurately, I would say, as a slow-motion genocide of the Palestinian population? We all know the answers for that. The US will always veto it. And China was thinking, look, one of these days they're going to use R2P to go against us in terms of what's going on in Tibet and Xinjiang, especially in Tibet. What's been going on in Tibet, maybe it's not a genocide, but civilians are being killed in Tibet on a constant basis, at least since the late 1990s. Only to talk about this past 10 years. In order to talk about the span covered by R2P, when they started discussing R2P in 2001. In Xinjiang, it's the same thing. Xinjiang, there are 500,000 Chinese troops basically occupying Xinjiang, which is basically an immense desert with one big city, Urumqi, lots of villages, and the rest is desert, but with lots of oil and gas, and very close to Central Asia and close to Russia as well. It's a very strategic area for China. And China simply cannot envision any splitists, as they call it, movement in Xinjiang, right? Russia was saying, look, maybe they could use this against us in terms of Chechnya. In Chechnya, there was, or there has been since the mid to late 80s, a civil war going on that was won by the Russian army at the price of a slow-motion genocide as well, by all means. So it depends, of course, on which major foreign power is conducting the framing of R2P. If it's the US, Britain, and France, it works because it's for our Western interests, right? But if it's going to be directed against Russia and China, other big powers, they know there's absolutely no chance that this will go on because it will be vetoed at the UN Security Council. So in terms of an international consensus about R2P, there is none whatsoever, right? So we're going to see R2P being implemented as long as Western powers especially find a window of opportunity to get a vote at the UN. If they don't get a vote at the UN, we're going to see what we're seeing in Syria at this moment, which is Saudi Arabia arming jihadis or Salafis in Syria and betting on a civil war, basically. And now with the help, as a matter of public record, in fact, of the United States.